In the early 20th century, a think tank was established that took on the role of translating Marxism from economic terms into cultural terms, and ultimately created political correctness as we know it today.
I mean, the Frankfurt School, for people who don't know anything about Frankfurt School philosophy, is a group of philosophers in the 1920s in Germany who were expatriates. They moved to the United States and basically infiltrated American universities. When Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, what he was trying to do was describe how he thought society was going to work. It was actually descriptive, not necessarily proscriptive. It was, here's what's going to happen. He thought class warfare would eventually break out and destroy the capitalist infrastructure. When that didn't happen, World War I basically dissuaded the international left of this because there was no class uprising to start World War I. It turned out that poor French people were happy to fight poor German people, and all of them were happy to fight poor Russian people. So when that fell apart, what the Frankfurt School decided is in order to make this change happen, we can't just wait for this change to happen, we have to change the culture. And the Frankfurt School basically decided to change the culture from the roots out.
The Frankfurt School would be the vehicle that translated Marxism from economic into cultural terms, giving us what we now know as political correctness.
Although the school was originally supposed to be known as the Institute for Marxism, they decided to change the name because it was not to their advantage to be openly identified as Marxist. The last thing political correctness wants is for people to figure out it's a form of Marxism. So instead they decided to name it the Institute for Social Research. One of the instrumental early members, Jorge Lukács, who was aware the class uprising predicted by Marx didn't happen in World War I, had to devise something else to create a revolution. He also theorized that the great obstacle to the creation of a Marxist paradise was the culture, Western civilization itself. Lukács identified that any political movement capable of bringing Bolshevism to the West would have to be, in his words, demonic.
Gramsci and Lukács argued that Western culture had blinded the working class to its true Marxist class interests. Before a Marxist revolution could take place, Western culture had to be destroyed.
New cultural forms must be found to increase the alienation of the population in order for it to understand how truly alienated it is to live without socialism. The task of the Frankfurt School then was first to undermine the Judeo-Christian legacy through an abolition of culture, and second to determine new cultural forms which would increase the alienation of the population, thus creating a new barbarianism.
In 1932, Herbert Marcuse became a member of the Institute for Social Research. Marcuse would ultimately become the most important member of the Frankfurt School for the development of political correctness. In the 1950s and 60s, Marcuse would complete the translation of Marxism into cultural terms and inject it into the New Left. It was Marcuse who finally answered the question posed by Horkheimer in the early 30s. Who could substitute for the working class as an agent of revolution?
And in the 60s, what they discovered is that instead of using class, which is difficult, it's difficult to get a poor white guy to sympathize with a poor black guy, instead what they would use as a proxy is racial groups. They would use racial groups to tear down the United States and the capitalist system, suggesting that racial groups are the victims of capitalism. If we can just pose a racial group against a racial group, then that, and mix in a little bit of socialism in there, we'll end up with a more civilized world.
The first was the idea of building a rainbow alliance of grievances. Yeah. And so they'd find different groups, they'd persuade them that Western society and the patriarchal society, capitalist society, the nation and so on, in some way discriminates against them, and then use that discrimination against them to bring them into a larger alliance of disparate groups, very often in fact mutually hostile and antagonistic, or certainly with different interests. A classic example now would be the way in which the left tries on the one side to mobilise and use the homosexual lobby, and on the other side works with radical Islam, which wants to stone homosexuals to death. There's no principles here, it's just a matter of them dragging everyone they can into this big broad church.
Breaking things down and mould them back together again in a way of destroying what society we've got left.
Indeed.
They decided to start cultural Marxism. And as we can see, cultural Marxism is exactly what communism is. But in addition to the economic factors that Karl Marx emphasized, they believe that culture is central to the legitimation of oppression. In other words, these people are going to say, the problem in society isn't necessarily the economics, which they are, but it's also the culture. It's because women are oppressed in movies. Black people aren't represented in comic books. Women are very mistreated in video games. And they are going to get strongholds and footholds into these subcultures. They're like parasites, if you will. It is a parasite ideology. Communism never builds anything. Communism isn't about building the equal society. Communism is about taking a society that already exists and cause a revolution within it. And this is exactly what cultural Marxists do. They go into comic books, for instance, comic book journalism, and then they start complaining, bitching, whining, signing petitions, trying to get things banned in order to get power, in order to have the authority to scare the shit out of the people that are drawing comic books, so that they only draw comic books according to their desires. And as you can see here, they are very much against capitalism, nationalism, the nuclear family, gender roles, race.
Just as classical economic Marxism argued that under capitalism, the working class was oppressed, so the Frankfurt School used Freud to argue that under Western culture, everyone lived in a constant state of psychological repression.
With the knowledge that everyone under Western values is oppressed, the key then was to dissect Western civilization, its art, its history, politics, and literature, and reinterpret all of it under the cultural Marxist lens. This deconstructionism, post-culturalism, represents almost the entire theoretical basis of all the politically correct aesthetic trends which now plague our universities. Cultural Marxism, or political correctness, says that all history is determined by power, by which groups defined in terms of race, sex, etc., have power over other groups. And the cultural Marxism, deconstructionism, which spearheads the reinterpretations of history, is known most commonly today as critical theory.
In the 1930s, the work of Horkheimer, Adorno, Fromm, and Marcuse issued in its first tangible product, critical theory. The term critical theory is something of a play on words. One is tempted to ask, what is the theory? The answer is, the theory is to criticize. Through unremitting, destructive criticism of every institution of Western society, they hope to bring that society down.
Critical theory says, let's tear everything down. Attack, attack, attack. Remember, the left never stops. I like to say they never stop, they never sleep, they never quit. They're always on the attack because they have nothing to defend. We're in this odd position of being the guys in the castle with a relentless horde of attackers. We can never defeat them.
Their idea was that they'd attack the foundations of Western civilization, because once they'd gone, it would make it easier to have a communist revolution. So that's where they started. And so they set about, they decided to do it primarily in two ways. The first was what they called the cultural critique, which was just a system of thought whereby they would simply critique, attack, verbally and intellectually attack aspects of Western civilization, the church, the family, democracy and so on, proper democracy. They'd simply attack and attack and attack, and like water dripping on a stone, would gradually wear it away. And the point isn't to come up with truthful attacks, the point is just to attack. They do it against us, they do it against me. You know, with plenty of this. They just invent whatever it is and then throw it at the target, and even when it's rebutted, don't then say, okay, sorry, we admit we were wrong, we'll leave you alone. Just carry on with the next lie, carry on with the next attack. So this cultural critique has been running since then against every angle of our society.
The Frankfurt School was important in Marxism because they no longer believed really in the future, they only believed in destroying. And if you look at today's campuses, that kind of nihilism is really the dominant theme. That is, attack America.
For the classical Marxist, it's Marxist economics. For the cultural Marxists, it's deconstruction. Deconstruction essentially takes any text, removes all meaning from it, and reinserts any desired meaning. So we find, for example, that all of Shakespeare is about the suppression of women, or the Bible is really about race and gender, and so on. The stuff we've been hearing about, the radical feminism, the women's studies departments, the gay studies departments, the black studies departments, all these things are branches of critical theory. What the Frankfurt School essentially does is draw on both Marx and Freud in the 1930s to create this theory called critical theory. The term is ingenious because you're tempted to ask, what is the theory? The theory is to criticize. The theory is the way to bring down Western culture, and the capitalist order is not to lay down an alternative, but criticize the existing.
The Frankfurt School was careful never to define what critical theory was for, only what it was against. Not only did they apply critical theory to American society, they added some new elements. One was the Institute's so-called Studies in Prejudice, which culminated in 1950 in Theodore Adorno's immensely influential book, The Authoritarian Personality. In it, Adorno argued that the American people possessed many fascist traits, and that anyone who supported traditional American culture was psychologically unbalanced. It is no accident that today, the politically correct are quick to label their opponents fascists. and suggest that they need psychological treatment in the form of sensitivity training.
You're a bigot. You're a fascist. You're homophobic. You're Islamophobic. You'll always notice that it's always an attack. It's not what they stand for, it's what they're against. Some of this critical theory involves things like cultural studies, post-colonial studies, women's studies, Aboriginal studies or Native American studies, African American studies. All of these studies, folks, are all childs of cultural Marxism because they're all based on the oppressor-oppressed paradigm that Marx talked about. Women, for example, are victims of a patriarchy. Women are told that Christianity is misogynist, that Christianity is a male-centered religion, that God has male pronouns and God has titles. The LGBTQ community is condemned by Christians who are homophobic. And so you could see that deep-seated anger against the West and Christianity as the cause of all evils. In the 1950s, Herbert Marcuse created a coalition of black students and feminist women and homosexuals and told them that the reason for their oppression was Western civilization, particularly Christianity. And he defined their struggle as an oppressor-oppressed paradigm. They instituted the studies on prejudice where Christianity was the enemy and was accused of being fascist, and Christians are fascists.
Critical theory actually attempted to politicize logic itself. Horkheimer wrote, "Logic is not independent of content. That means an argument is logical if it helps destroy Western culture, illogical if it supports it." Such twisted thought lies at the heart of the political correctness now inculcated into American university students.
Critical theory could be used to redefine previous ideas. Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Beethoven, all legends, all authors, all founders of religions, and the very religions themselves await their exposed resurrection. These atrocities occur because the perpetrators are able to plausibly demonstrate in the tradition with other cultural Marxists that Shakespeare's intent is irrelevant. What is important is the racist or misogynistic subtext of which Shakespeare was unconscious of. The artist does not consciously create works in order to uplift society, but instead unconsciously transmits the ideological assumptions of the culture into which he was born. Epistemology explodes on the scene. The issue is no longer what is universally true, but what can be plausibly interpreted by the self-appointed guardians. Comparative literature, or deconstructionism, is the last predictable stage in the suppression of reason and the denial of the possibility of truth in the name of philosophy. The interpreter's creative activity is more important than the actual text. Thus, the one thing most necessary for us, the knowledge of what these texts have to tell us, is turned over to this objective. When the local women's studies or third world studies department organizes students to abandon the classics in favor of modern black and feminist authors, the reasons given are directly from the Frankfurt School. It is not that these modern writers are better, but they are somehow more truthful because their alienation reflects the modern social problems of which the older authors were ignorant. The worst crime was the belief that each individual was gifted with sovereign reason, which could enable him to determine what is right or wrong for the whole society. Thus, to tell people that you have a reasonable idea to which they should conform is authoritarian. This philosophical sleight of hand allows one to do several destructive things. By making art, history, and creativity historically specific, one cannot hypothesize universal truth or natural law, for truth is completely relative to historical development, or so they'll say. By discarding the idea of truth and error, you also may throw out the obsolete concept of good and evil. If these campus antics appear retarded, that is because they are designed to be. The Frankfurt School's most important breakthrough consists in the realization that their monstrous theories could become dominant in the culture as a result of the changes in society. This meant that even new and unpalatable ideas could become popular by renaming them.
Conservatives believe there is such a thing as truth, that the truth is based on reality and reality is made up of facts. This is why you often see conservatives pointing at charts and discussing the latest research just before a large angry crowd attacks them with clubs and beats them into a bleeding mass of pulpy flesh. Leftists have another point of view, sometimes called relativism, postmodernism, or lying. You see, leftists believe there is no such thing as objective truth. As American philosopher Richard Rorty wrote, quote, and this is a real quote, "Objectivity is a matter of intersubjective consensus among human beings, not of accurate representation of something non-human." Essentially, leftists believe that truth is a story that we tell. This makes language very important because language creates the story that creates the truth. Leftists, therefore, are very concerned with what things are called. If someone who can't walk is called crippled, for instance, that's prejudicial because it creates the impression that he can't walk. Instead, we should refer to him as handicapped. Then, when people start to realize that handicapped is actually a euphemism for crippled, we should call him differently abled. And when that comes to mean crippled, we should call him special. And because leftists believe that truth is just a story we tell, they are very good at telling stories. That's why leftists are very successful at creating fiction, as they do in Hollywood and in the New York Times. Finally, because leftists believe that truth is just a story, they have to make sure that stories they disagree with don't get told. This explains why leftists blacklist conservatives in Hollywood, why they commit acts of violence when conservative speakers come to universities. You see, leftists believe their story is a great one. It's a story of equality and peace and universal love. So if you disagree with it, they'll destroy you.
Critical theory, deconstructionism, and post-culturalism taught to reinterpret history to be what it wasn't, and diligently taught that reason isn't. With reason gone, the ugliness we see around us has been consciously fostered and organized in such a way that a majority of the population is losing the cognitive ability to transmit to the next generation the ideas and methods upon which our civilization was built. In the beginning, it was a formal political conspiracy to popularize theories that were specifically designed to weaken the soul of Judeo-Christian civilization in such a way as to make people believe that adherence to universal truth was evidence of authoritarianism, and that reason itself was suspect. For the Frankfurt School scholars, the effective way to defang the oppressors is to persuade them that they are actually ignorant of good. The inflamed sensitivity induced by radicalized democratic theory finally experiences any limit as arbitrary and tyrannical. With reason gone and the rejection of the backbone of Western civilization, Christianity and the family structure, which enabled citizens to govern themselves without the need for massive government, became exposed. Their goal was the creation of a definition of authoritarianism which could be exploited to force the scientifically planned re-education of Americans and Europeans away from the principles of Judeo-Christian civilization.
Lukács introduced a radical sex education program into the Hungarian schools. Political correctness, as we know it, was already beginning to take form.
He tried to actually undermine the unity of the family, and that was one of the reasons that he tried to introduce sex education.
Laszlo Pastor, a leader in the Hungarian resistance against the communist takeover of Hungary after World War II, explains why children were targeted.
It's always much tougher to convert an adult, to do something what he was taught not to do.
The key to the Frankfurt School's work on culture was the crossing of Marx with Freud.
The addition of Freud adds a new element of being sexually repressed and need of liberation. Freud's element of sexual repression justifies the sexual liberation movement and the practice of polygamy and sexual promiscuity, which have long been discouraged in Western society. He provided a license for the centrality of sex in the public life. Freud was unknowingly following in the line of Hobbes, who said that each man should look at what he feels, not thinks. In principle, he was supposed to long to be all virtue, to break free from the chains of bodily desires. This absoluteness of desire, uninhibited by thoughts of virtue, is what is found in the state of nature. It represents the turn in philosophy away from trying to tame or perfect desire by virtue and toward finding out what one's desire is and living according to it. All higher purpose in nature, which might have been consulted by men's reason and used to limit his passion, has disappeared. The key to the entire Frankfurt School program is the liberation of Aristotelian eros. Destroy eros, destroy the family, destroy Christianity, and together equal the socialist revolution. The eroticism of the counterculture meant much more than free love and a violent attack on the nuclear family. It also meant the legitimization of philosophical eros, an element which is central to political correctness, and that's the sexual element.
Marcuse's Eros and Civilization condemned all restrictions on sexual behavior, calling instead for polymorphous perversity. Polymorphous perversity helped open the door to aspects of political correctness, such as gay liberation.
This is his idea of what human society, a good human society, should be based on, was a certain kind of polymorphous perversity and narcissism, which by liberating non-procreative eros, was his term, we would find great enlightenment and great happiness. This was supposed to be the key to utopia.
The 60s, I mean, it was a way of, people always think up complicated theories to, do what they want to do. People wanted to do a lot in the 60s. Herbert Marcuse, gave them the intellectual justification for having a lot of sex with a lot of people, a lot of the time.
Marcuse argues that under a capitalist order, repression is the essence of that order. We can envision a future if we can only destroy this existing oppressive order in which we liberate eros, we liberate libido, in which we have a world of polymorphous perversity in which you can do your own thing. Marcuse led the way for the complete revival of the rest of the Frankfurt School theorists, reintroducing the long-forgotten Lukács. People were trained to see themselves as objects determined by their natures. The importance of the individuals was replaced by the idea that the person is important because he or she is a black or a woman or homosexual. Discussion of women's civil rights was forced into being just another liberation cult, complete with bra burning and other rituals, demonstrates their complete reliance on Frankfurt School leaders and other Freudian extremists. Freedom of speech has given way to freedom of expression, in which the obscene gesture enjoys the same protected status as demonstrative discourse. All that has really happened is that reason has been knocked off its perch, is less influential and more vulnerable as it joins the crowd of less worthy claims. This popularization of life as an erotic, pessimistic ritual did not abate, but in fact deepen over the 20 years leading to today. It is the basis of the horror we see around us. The heirs of Marcuse and Adorno completely dominate the universities, teaching their students to replace reason with politically correct ritual exercises. The Frankfurt School's original 1930 survey work included the authoritarian personality, which was based on the psychoanalytic categories developed by Erich Fromm. Fromm claimed that human civilization was originally matriarchal. Later, Fromm utilized this theory to claim the support for the nuclear family was evidence of authoritarian tendencies. In Fromm's view, masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences, they were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Therefore, sex was a social construct.
Another new member was Erich Fromm. Fromm, a practicing psychoanalyst, was noted for his radical Marxist social psychology. He pioneered the concept of sexual liberation and gender politics. According to Martin Jay, in Fromm's view, masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences. They were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined.
Cultural Marxists absurdly denied the biological reality of gender and race and argued that gender and race are social constructs. They believe that men and women are 100% similar. The only difference is the genital organ, and even that can be changed through surgery.
Coming back to the situation people face on campus, Marcuse defines liberating tolerance as intolerance for anything coming from the right and tolerance for anything coming from the left. Its authoritarian personality work was designed to identify people who were not sufficiently revolutionary so that these people could be re-educated. When the Frankfurt School expanded its research after World War II, its goal was to measure adherence to the core beliefs of Western Judeo-Christian civilization so that these beliefs could be characterized as authoritarian and thus discredited. The Frankfurt School's authoritarian personality profile was a weapon to be used against its political enemies. It is the measure of our own cultural collapse. That this definition of authoritarianism is acceptable to most citizens and is freely used by political operations like the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center to demonize their political enemies. It is this extreme version of the authoritarian personality thesis which is the operant philosophy of today's Cult Awareness Network, a group which works with the U.S. Justice Department and the Anti-Defamation League, among others. Using standard Frankfurt School methods, they identify political and religious groups which are its political enemies, then relabels them as a cult in order to justify operations against them. In other words, any adherence to Western Judeo-Christian beliefs is a form of repression, and this is what people say marginalizes other groups. The witch hunt on today's campuses is merely the implementation of Marcuse's concept of repressive toleration, tolerance for movements from the left, but intolerance for movements from the right. The totalitarian nature of political correctness is revealed nowhere more clearly than on college campuses, many of which are now small ivy-covered North Koreas, where the student or faculty member who dares to cross any of the lines set up by the gender feminists or the homosexual rights activists or any other victim groups quickly find themselves in judicial trouble. That's a great look into the future that political correctness intends for the nation as a whole.
He defined liberating tolerance as tolerance for all ideas coming from the left and intolerance as those coming from the right. Sound familiar? Special interest groups who champion tolerance, as I said, you'll find to be the most intolerant.